I had been working as a nurse in the children's ward for about a year when strange things began happening. It was a tough job, but I loved caring for the kids and helping them get better. One night, while doing my rounds, I heard the sound of a child laughing. It was past visiting hours, and most of the children were asleep. I followed the sound to one of the playrooms. Inside, the lights flickered, and toys were scattered around as if someone had been playing with them. But there was no one there. I felt a chill and quickly left the room, telling myself it was just my imagination. Over the next few weeks, the laughter continued. I would hear it in the hallways, in empty rooms, and even in the elevator. The other nurses started noticing it too, and we all felt uneasy. One of my colleagues told me that the ward was rumored to be haunted by a little girl named Lily, who had died of a rare illness years ago. Determined to find out more, I researched the hospital's history. I found an old photo of Lily, a sweet-looking girl with curly hair and a bright smile. She had spent her last days in the playroom where she loved to laugh and play. The more I learned about her, the more I felt connected to her spirit. One night, I decided to stay late and see if I could communicate with Lily. I brought one of her favorite toys, a stuffed bunny, to the playroom and sat down, talking softly. I told her that we knew she was there and that she didn't have to be afraid. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, and I heard a faint giggle. I felt a presence beside me and saw the stuffed bunny move slightly. I kept talking, telling Lily that she was safe and loved. After a few minutes, the room grew warmer, and the giggling stopped. I left the toy in the playroom as a gesture of goodwill. From that night on, the strange occurrences in the children's ward ceased. The laughter was replaced by a sense of peace. I like to believe that Lily finally found comfort and moved on. Though I never saw her again, I often think of her and the brief haunting connection we shared. Working the night shift in the psychiatric ward was always challenging, but it became unbearable after the strange events began. The patients often spoke of seeing things, but I usually dismissed it as part of their conditions. That changed one fateful night. It started with whispers. I was doing my rounds when I heard faint voices coming from one of the empty rooms. The door was ajar, and as I approached, the whispers grew louder. I pushed the door open, but the room was empty. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence. The following nights, the whispers returned, always from different rooms. They sounded like multiple people talking at once, but I could never make out the words. My colleagues began to notice it too, and we all felt a growing sense of dread. One night, while checking on a particularly distressed patient, I saw something that shook me to my core. The patient, who had been heavily sedated, was sitting up in bed, staring at the corner of the room. When I asked what he was looking at, he pointed and said, "The man in the shadows." I turned to look, but saw nothing. The patient continued to insist that a shadowy figure was standing there, watching him. As I left the room, I felt a cold presence behind me, and the whispers began again. This time, they were louder and more insistent. Desperate for answers, I spoke to an older nurse who had worked there for decades. She told me that the psychiatric ward was built on the site of an old asylum where many patients had died under terrible conditions. Some believed their spirits still lingered, unable to find peace. That night, I decided to confront the entity. Armed with a crucifix and a prayer book, I walked through the ward, reciting prayers and asking the spirits to leave. The air grew colder, and the whispers reached a crescendo, but I continued, my voice steady. Suddenly, the temperature returned to normal, and the whispers stopped. The ward felt lighter, and the patients seemed calmer. The shadowy figure and the whispers never returned. I like to think that the restless spirits finally found peace, released from the torment that bound them. I had been working as a nurse for several years and thought I had seen it all. But nothing could have prepared me for the night I encountered the crying woman. It was a busy night with the usual influx of patients when I first heard the sobbing. I followed the sound to an empty examination room. The sobbing grew louder as I approached, but when I entered, the room was empty. I checked the adjoining rooms, but there was no sign of anyone. I shrugged it off, thinking it must have been my imagination. Over the next few nights, the sobbing continued. It was always the same, an intense, heart-wrenching cry that seemed to come from nowhere. I asked my colleagues if they had heard it, but they all said no. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. One night, while checking on a patient in another part of the ER, I heard the sobbing again, louder and more desperate than ever. I followed the sound to the same examination room and found a woman sitting on the floor, her face buried in her hands. She was wearing an old-fashioned hospital gown, and her long hair obscured her face. I approached her cautiously, asking if she was okay. She didn't respond, just kept crying. When I reached out to touch her shoulder, she vanished. I stood there, stunned and terrified. I reported the incident to my supervisor, who looked at me with a mix of concern and disbelief. Determined to find out more, I spoke to an elderly janitor who had been working at the hospital for decades. He told me about a woman who had died in that very room many years ago. She had been brought in after a car accident, but her injuries were too severe. She had spent her last moments crying in pain and despair. Armed with this information, I decided to try and help the spirit find peace. I brought a small candle and some flowers to the examination room and said a prayer for her soul. I told her that she was no longer alone and that she could move on. The sobbing stopped, and the room felt lighter. I never heard the crying woman again, and the examination room no longer felt oppressive. I like to think that she finally found peace, and that my small gesture helped her move on from the pain that had trapped her there. The isolation ward was always a place of fear and sadness. Patients with contagious diseases were kept there, away from others. It was a quiet, lonely part of the hospital, and I dreaded working there. One night, I was assigned to monitor a patient in isolation who had a severe case of tuberculosis. As I was checking the patient's vitals, I noticed something strange. In the reflection of the glass window, I saw a shadowy figure standing behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. I brushed it off as a trick of the light and continued my work. The next night, the figure appeared again, this time closer. It was a tall, thin man with hollow eyes and a gaunt face. He stood silently, watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine and quickly left the room. The figure seemed to follow me, appearing in reflections and dark corners of the ward. I spoke to a senior nurse about the figure, and she told me that the isolation ward had a dark history. During a tuberculosis outbreak in the early 1900s, many patients had died there, and their spirits were said to haunt the ward. One of them was a doctor who had contracted the disease while treating patients and died a slow, painful death. Determined to confront the spirit, I stayed late one night, hoping to communicate with him. I brought a photo of the old doctor, found in the hospital archives, and placed it in the room where he often appeared. I spoke to him, telling him that his work was appreciated and that he could rest now. The figure appeared once more, standing silently by the window. I felt a wave of sadness and gratitude wash over me. Slowly, the figure faded, and the room felt warmer. The oppressive atmosphere in the isolation ward lifted, and the sightings ceased. I like to think that the doctor's spirit finally found peace, knowing that his dedication and sacrifice were remembered. The isolation ward, once a place of fear, became just another part of the hospital, free from the haunting presence that had lingered there for so long. I had been working as a nurse in the emergency department for several years, and strange occurrences were not uncommon. But the night I encountered the phantom patient was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was a busy night, and we were overwhelmed with patients. Amidst the chaos, I noticed a man sitting quietly in one of the waiting area chairs. He looked pale and sickly, clutching his chest as if in pain. I approached him, but before I could reach him, he disappeared. I thought he might have wandered off, so I asked the receptionist if she had seen him. She hadn't. I checked the restrooms and nearby rooms, but there was no sign of him. I was starting to think I had imagined it when I saw him again, this time in one of the treatment rooms. He was lying on the bed, looking even worse than before. I called out to him, but he vanished once more. I spoke to a few of my colleagues, and one of the older nurses pulled me aside. She told me that the man matched the description of a patient who had died in the emergency department years ago from a heart attack. His spirit was said to roam the halls, reliving his final moments. Determined to help the restless spirit, I found out more about the man. His name was John, and he had been a kind and gentle soul. I brought a small bouquet of flowers and a photo of him, which I had found in the hospital archives, to the treatment room where he had last appeared. I spoke softly, telling him that he was no longer alone and that he could move on. I felt a presence in the room, and the temperature dropped. The man appeared one last time, standing by the bed, looking at me with sad, grateful eyes. Slowly, he faded away, and the room grew warmer. The sightings of the phantom patient ceased after that night. The emergency department returned to its usual chaos, but the atmosphere was lighter. I like to think that John finally found peace, knowing that his story was remembered and that he was no longer alone in his suffering.